The night was cold and damp, and the city lights reflected off the puddles that had formed on the poorly lit streets. Lucas was running, breathless, trying not to look back. His footsteps echoed on the wet asphalt, accompanied only by the distant sound of sirens. He felt like he was being followed, but the darkness around him gave no clear sign of his pursuers. The weight in his coat pocket seemed to grow with every step, as if the old watch he carried was draining his energy. Vernier's watch, always present, always pulsing with a mystery he had yet to fully comprehend. The message on Lucas' phone, sent just minutes before, had jolted him out of any attempt at rest. "The time has come," the message said, with no sender. What it meant, he didn't know, but the sense of danger was undeniable. There was no ignoring the fact that the watch was at the center of something much bigger. Lucas ran his hand over his pocket, feeling the cold texture of the aged metal. He knew the object held secrets beyond his understanding, secrets that someone desperately wanted back. He turned a corner and darted into a narrower street, trying to control his breathing. A light rain started to fall, soaking his jacket, but he barely noticed the discomfort. His focus was on finding a place to hide, somewhere he could think, at least for a moment. He crouched behind an old dumpster, watching the deserted street in front of him, scanning for any signs of movement. Nothing. For a moment, silence dominated, except for the frantic beating of his heart. Slowly, he pulled the watch from his pocket. He observed its flawless finish, the smooth metal reflecting the dim light of a distant street lamp. He knew this watch wasn't just a simple heirloom. There was something more to it. Something that the late billionaire Otto Vernier had carefully planned. Lucas opened the watch cautiously, expecting to see the same gears he had inspected before, but this time, something was different. A small compartment opened, revealing a tiny folded piece of paper inside. With trembling hands, he unfolded the paper. The words written there seemed to echo in his mind before he even finished reading. "Choose wisely. Time is running out." Nothing more. Just those words. What did it mean? What was Vernier trying to tell him? A chill ran down Lucas' spine. He knew it was more than just a warning. The silence around him became unnerving. It was as if the city was waiting, watching, about to reveal something terrible. Lucas looked around again but saw nothing. Maybe he was just being paranoid, or maybe there really was something happening. His eyes returned to the watch, now an even greater enigma. What was Vernier trying to say? And why, out of all people, had Lucas been chosen to bear this burden? This wasn't the first time he had felt this way. Since receiving the watch as part of Vernier's will, his life had taken a drastic turn. The ordinary days as an attorney specializing in wills had been replaced by a spiral of inexplicable events. Vernier's name was everywhere, and Lucas could no longer ignore that there was something very dark behind this whole story. Suddenly, he heard a sound. Footsteps, this time closer. His breath caught. Lucas quickly shoved the watch back into his pocket and stood up, ready to run again. The sound of footsteps was approaching, and he knew staying still wasn't an option. He needed answers, but first, he needed safety. Without hesitation, Lucas resumed running, his mind focused solely on finding a place where he could stop and understand what was happening. The alleys twisted into a confusing maze. Shadows moved, or maybe it was just his imagination, but the fear tightening his chest was real. The rain grew heavier, and the cold wind cut across his face. The watch felt heavier and heavier, as if connected directly to his emotions. He needed to get out, fast. As he turned another corner, Lucas spotted the faint light of an old warehouse. A long-abandoned place he knew from years before. Without a second thought, he ran toward it and forced the door, which gave way easily. The inside was cold and silent, but at least it was a place to hide. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, trying to organize his thoughts. Lucas opened the watch again, studying every detail of its design. That watch had been shrouded in mystery from the beginning, and now, more than ever, he needed to understand why Vernier had left it to him. The short, cryptic message on the tiny piece of paper wasn't enough. He needed more. He knew the answer lay within the watch, but he couldn't fully decipher it yet. As he pondered what to do next, Lucas' phone buzzed again. The sound echoed in the empty warehouse. He grabbed the device with trembling hands and looked at the screen. Another message, again without a sender, appeared. "The time has come. You can't run." Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the tension rise even further. Vernier's watch held secrets he needed to unlock, but the answers seemed further away with each passing minute. He knew that time was running out. The warehouse was almost entirely engulfed in darkness, save for a few streaks of light that managed to slip through the grimy windows. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing pulse, but the feeling that something was watching him still clung to him. He knew he couldn't stay there for long. Vernier's watch, now back in his pocket, seemed to grow heavier by the minute, as though it carried the weight of a responsibility he still didn't fully understand. The phone still vibrated in his hand. The message, "You can't run," echoed in his mind, heightening his sense that he was trapped. He didn't have many options. The organization, whoever they were, always seemed to be one step ahead, monitoring his moves, anticipating his actions. Lucas knew he needed to find out who was behind this, and fast. The name that came to mind was Sam. Sam had always been his go-to contact for situations like this, someone who knew how to operate in the shadows and, more importantly, someone who understood the hidden world of conspiracies. He and Lucas had worked together years ago, and though they were no longer in regular contact, Sam was one of the few people Lucas could still trust. At least, he hoped so. Lucas grabbed his phone and quickly sent Sam a message. "I need help. Can you meet me?" He hesitated for a moment before hitting send, unsure if the request would be welcomed. He knew involving someone else in this could be dangerous, but at this point, he didn't have much choice. He needed answers, and more than anything, he needed to know if Sam was still on his side. Minutes later, a reply appeared, "Meet me at Warehouse 12 in an hour." The quick response eased some of Lucas' tension, but the danger was still there. The organization chasing Vernier, and now Lucas, was powerful, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get the watch. The watch, more than just an heirloom, was something they considered essential to their plans. But Lucas still didn't fully grasp why. And if Vernier was dead, what had the billionaire known that could have triggered this relentless hunt? An hour later, Lucas was nearing Warehouse 12, located in the abandoned industrial section of the city. The place had an oppressive, desolate atmosphere, with old, rusted warehouses that seemed long forgotten. He saw Sam waiting by the entrance, wearing his usual baseball cap and worn-out jacket. Even from a distance, Sam looked uneasy, his eyes constantly scanning the area around him. Lucas approached, trying to remain calm, but the weight of the situation was visible on his face. He knew Sam would sense something was wrong immediately. When they got close enough to speak, Lucas didn't waste time with pleasantries. "They're after me," he said bluntly. "And it's because of Vernier's watch." Sam stared at him for a few seconds, saying nothing. His eyes scanned Lucas, as if assessing how bad the situation really was. Finally, he nodded, signaling for Lucas to follow him inside the warehouse. Once they were inside, silence dominated the space. Sam stopped and slowly turned to face Lucas. "I know," Sam said, his voice calm but carrying a heavy undertone. Lucas frowned, confused. "What do you mean, you know?" Sam sighed, removing his cap and running a hand over his head. "The organization that's after you. They came after me too." Tried to recruit me a while back. I knew they'd be back, sooner or later. A chill ran down Lucas' spine. Are you working for them? Sam shook his head, frustrated. No, I'm not working for them. But they pressured me, Lucas. More than you can imagine. Whatever you're carrying with that watch, it's something they want badly. And they'll stop at nothing to get it. Lucas felt the weight of Sam's words. He wanted to trust him, but everything around him seemed to conspire against that. The fact that Sam had been approached by the same organization only confirmed how deep this went. Vernier's watch was the key to something bigger, and Lucas was at the center of this dangerous web. What do you know about them? Lucas asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of his voice. Why do they want the watch so badly? Sam took a deep breath, as if hesitating to answer. What I know is that this organization has been around a lot longer than any of us can imagine. They operate in the shadows, influencing governments, major corporations, shaping the future in ways we can't see. And that watch, it's a tool, a mechanism that can alter the order of things. And you, Lucas, are holding it. Lucas tried to process what Sam was saying. Alter the order of things? It didn't make sense, but by now, he knew Vernier's watch had already shown it wasn't just a simple artifact. He ran his hand over the watch in his pocket, feeling the weight pressing down on him. Sam continued. They told me the watch holds a power, something that can change fate. I don't know how it works, but they believe it. And if they believe it, it's because it's real. That's why they're hunting you. Lucas felt a knot form in his throat. He thought of Vernier, the mystery of his reclusive life, and what he had discovered. The billionaire had built an empire, but he had also left behind a legacy of secrets that now threatened to consume Lucas. He knew there was no more time to waste. The organization was closing in, and he needed to find a way to stay ahead of them. What do I do now, Sam? Lucas asked, his voice low, almost desperate. How do I stop this? Sam looked at him, his eyes filled with a gravity Lucas hadn't seen in a long time. You can't stop it, Lucas. You can only survive it. And if you want to survive, you have to go deeper. Find the answers Vernier left. Because trust me, he knew this would happen. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the watch grow heavier in his pocket. He knew the game had changed. Now, it was a race against time, and every move he made could be his last. Vernier's watch, so small and seemingly harmless, held more than he could ever have imagined. And Lucas, the lawyer who had never wanted this burden, was now caught in a web of secrets, lies, and power that wouldn't stop chasing him anytime soon. The night was quiet as Lucas left the warehouse, the photo of his mother still tightly held in his hands. The revelation that she had somehow been involved in the mystery of the watch rattled him deeply. How had she known? And why had she never said anything? The organization, with its silent promises and threats, now seemed to be closing in on him like a carefully woven web. But more than ever, Lucas felt he was nearing the core of this mystery, and at the same time, reaching the limit of his strength. As he walked through the abandoned corridors, he felt a weight on his shoulders, as if the air around him had grown heavier. His footsteps echoed in the emptiness, accompanied only by the sound of his tense breathing. There was no easy way out. There was no simple choice. Lucas knew that the organization had been manipulating everything from the beginning, guiding him like a piece in a game he barely understood. When he reached the exit of the building, he paused for a moment to catch his breath. The silence around him felt ominous, like something was about to happen. He looked at the watch in his pocket, the artifact that had caused all this chaos. Ever since he'd received it, his life had spiraled into a maze of confusion and secrets. Now, he knew he was about to uncover what was really at stake. It was then that he felt a familiar presence. Slowly turning around, Lucas saw Marcos leaning against a wall, half of his face shrouded in shadow. He didn't seem surprised to see him there. "I knew you'd get this far," Marcos said, his voice calm but laced with tension. "It was only a matter of time." Lucas narrowed his eyes, the distrust that had been gnawing at him since their last encounter now sharpening. "What are you doing here, Marcos?" "I'm here because this involves more than you think." And more than I wanted to admit, Marcos stepped out of the shadows, revealing a face that mixed weariness and resolve. "The watch, Lucas. They want the watch, and they won't stop until they get it." Lucas took a step forward, his eyes locked on Marcos. "And you? Are you working for them now?" Marcos shook his head, seeming to carry the weight of a difficult decision. "It's not about working for them or against them. It's about what's at stake. What's at stake is much bigger than me, you, or any of us." Lucas frowned. "What are you talking about?" Marcos hesitated for a moment, his eyes fixed on the ground before finally looking up at Lucas. "You think the sacrifice they mentioned is about you. But it's not. The sacrifice isn't your life, Lucas. It's someone close to you." The words hit Lucas like a punch. He stared at Marcos, searching for some indication that this was a lie, some manipulation. But Marcos didn't seem to be trying to deceive him. His expression was serious, almost tragic. "What do you mean by that?" Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Your mother, Lucas. She knew everything. She knew you were destined for this. She knew that one day you would be the one chosen to carry the watch. She tried to protect you, but in doing so, she sealed her own fate. Her sacrifice has already been made." Lucas felt as if the ground beneath him was crumbling. Everything began to make sense, but in a cruel and distorted way. His mother, the woman he had always believed to be a victim of a tragic accident, had been involved in this from the start. And now he understood why the organization had been so interested in him. He wasn't just any pawn, he was the key to something far greater. Marcos took another step forward. "What they want isn't just the watch. They want the power it represents. The power to control fate, time, reality itself. And you, Lucas, are the only one who can give that to them. Or destroy it all." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Lucas looked at the watch in his pocket, as if seeing for the first time the true weight of the object. He had always known there was more to it, but now he understood the depth of this mystery. His mother had died to protect him. And now, he was the only one who could stop the power of the watch from falling into the wrong hands. Lucas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. He couldn't keep running. There was no escaping the choice that lay before him. He had to confront the organization, understand the secrets the watch held, and perhaps, accept the sacrifice that came with it. Marcos stood by, watching him, as if waiting for Lucas' response. But Lucas already knew what he had to do. There was no more running. Lucas walked past Marcos, eyes fixed on the exit of the building, and said, his voice firm and determined, "The game is over." Lucas walked through the deserted street with firm steps. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing, replaying every moment, every revelation. What Marcos had said about the sacrifice, about his mother, still lingered like a heavy shadow in his thoughts. Everything Lucas thought he knew about his life was now distorted by this new reality. The organization, the watch, his mother's fate, it was all part of an intricate web he was only beginning to understand. The watch seemed heavier now. The power it carried, the secret it held, was greater than Lucas had ever imagined. What had once seemed like a rare artifact, something left to him in a will, now revealed itself as a dangerous tool, capable of shaping the future. The organization wanted it desperately for a simple reason: the watch was the key to controlling time. And not just time in the linear sense, but fate itself, choices, the very fabric of reality. Lucas ran his hand over his pocket, feeling the cold metal under his fingers. He knew he was approaching the heart of this mystery. He didn't have all the answers yet, but it was clear the watch was far more than a symbol of power. It was a weapon that could be used to change the course of events, manipulate lives, and potentially rewrite history. Reaching a small bridge, he stopped, looking down at the river below. The water flowed slowly and quietly, reflecting the lights of the city around it. He took the watch out of his pocket and held it in his hand, staring at every detail of its design. How could something so small hold so much power? The answer was there, hidden in the mechanism Vernier had protected for so many years. Then, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. There was a small symbol engraved on the back of the watch, almost imperceptible. It was some sort of emblem, something ancient, with an aesthetic that reminded him of lost civilizations. Lucas ran his fingers over the symbol, feeling its texture. He knew this was important, that there were more secrets hidden in the watch than he had imagined. Slowly, he opened the watch and, once again, observed the internal workings. But now, with a more focused eye, he saw something different. There was a small hidden compartment at the bottom, disguised among the gears. Using a makeshift tool, Lucas managed to open the compartment, revealing a tiny electronic chip, wrapped in a thin layer of metal. He carefully took the chip out, trying to understand its purpose. The revelation came quickly: this chip was the true key to the power of the watch. It wasn't just a mechanical device. The watch was a technological artifact, something far more advanced than it appeared at first glance. Vernier had built an interface between the past and the future, and the chip was the central piece that allowed the watch to manipulate time itself. A chill ran through Lucas. He now understood what was at stake. The watch wasn't just a relic. It was a device capable of altering entire realities. The organization wasn't after him because of the object's value; they wanted the absolute power the watch offered, the power to control not just the future, but the past as well. As the magnitude of this revelation sank in, Lucas realized he had a choice to make. He could try to use the watch to reverse what had happened to his mother, to change his own fate, or he could destroy the device and ensure it would never be used by the wrong hands. But this decision was harder than he expected. What would happen if he tried to change the past? The consequences were unpredictable, and he knew tampering with time was extremely dangerous. Lucas snapped the watch shut and put it back in his pocket. He knew he couldn't make this decision impulsively. He needed time to think, to understand all the implications of what was coming. The organization, however, wouldn't give him that time. They were already after him, and now, with the discovery of the chip, he knew the final confrontation was near. With quick steps, he returned to his car and drove away from the city, trying to process everything he had learned. He knew he needed to prepare for what was coming, for the moment when he would have to face the organization and decide the fate of the watch. As he drove, Lucas glanced briefly at the night sky, feeling the weight of what was to come. He was no longer just a lawyer handling an unusual will. Now, he was the guardian of something much bigger, something that could shape the future in ways he could barely imagine. The sacrifice had already begun. And Lucas knew that soon, he would have to make the final decision. Lucas walked through the winding, empty road as his mind continued to process the latest revelations. He knew he couldn't delay the confrontation with the organization any longer. The watch in his pocket felt heavier than ever, like it was pulsing with its own energy, knowing the end of its journey was near. The location indicated by the coordinates from the last message was only a few miles away, and Lucas could already feel the weight of what was about to happen. The watch, now with the revealed chip, was not just an ancient artifact, it was a tool capable of controlling fate itself. Lucas understood that, in the wrong hands, it could be used to manipulate events and decisions, rewriting the very history of humanity. The organization, with its hidden power and dark ambitions, was just steps away from gaining control of that power unless Lucas could stop them. When he arrived at the location, the first thing he noticed was the silence. It was an old facility, hidden deep within a remote forest, a place that seemed to have been forgotten by time. The trees surrounding it were dense, like silent guardians of something dark. Lucas stepped out of the car and walked slowly, each step echoing in the quiet. The sky was overcast, and the heavy atmosphere gave the impression that the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. As he entered the building, a thick, suffocating air enveloped him. The concrete walls and reinforced metal doors indicated that this place had once been a high-security facility, but now it was abandoned and crumbling. Lucas followed the main hallway until he reached a larger room, where, in the center, a man was waiting for him. The leader of the organization, with a cold and calculating appearance, stood there with his hands clasped behind his back. His eyes were icy, and the faint smile on his face indicated that he was in control of the situation. Lucas recognized the type immediately, a manipulator, someone used to being 2 steps ahead of everyone else. He had been expecting Lucas. "Finally, Lucas," the man said, his voice echoing through the empty walls. "I knew you would get here. Everything we've done was to ensure you had no choice." Lucas looked around, trying to keep calm. "And now that I'm here? What do you want?" The man took a step forward, his eyes locked on the watch that Lucas held tightly. "You know what we want. The watch. It belongs to us. It always has." "It belonged to Vernier," Lucas shot back. "He left it to me. And he knew you'd come for it." The smile on the leader's face grew, as if he were enjoying the conversation. "Vernier knew far more than you realize. But even he couldn't escape his fate. He tried, of course. Tried to resist, just as you're doing now. But in the end, he understood that the sacrifice was necessary. That certain forces cannot be fought." Lucas narrowed his eyes, feeling the tension in the air grow. "What do you mean by sacrifice?" The man took another step, approaching slowly, almost as if explaining something obvious to a child. "The watch, Lucas, is not just a tool of control. It requires a sacrifice to be fully activated. Something Vernier, in his time, understood too late. And now, you face the same choice." Lucas took a slight step back, trying to process what he was hearing. Vernier's sacrifice, his mother, it was all connected. The watch wasn't just a symbol of power. It demanded something in return, something Vernier had tried to avoid. But what exactly was at stake? Lucas looked at the watch, feeling the weight of each word the man was saying pile on top of him. The leader stopped a few feet from Lucas, his eyes fixed on the watch. "You have 2 choices. You can hand over the watch and free yourself from all of this. Or you can use it and accept the sacrifice. But know this, the power it offers does not come without a cost." Lucas felt the dilemma growing larger in his mind. If he handed over the watch, he could finally walk away from this spiral of chaos. But at what cost? What would the organization do with that power? They would use the watch to manipulate the world in their own way, rewriting history as they saw fit. And if he used the watch, what would he have to sacrifice? His life? Something more? The implications were too deep to ignore. The leader of the organization smiled again, sensing Lucas' hesitation. "It's a difficult decision, I know. But remember, the watch chose you for a reason. It knows what you must do." Lucas looked at the watch one last time. He knew he couldn't let that power fall into the wrong hands, even if it meant sacrificing something he didn't fully understand yet. Feeling the weight of his choice, he closed his eyes for a moment, searching for the strength to do what had to be done. Without further hesitation, Lucas activated the watch, inserting the chip he had discovered earlier. The air around him seemed to vibrate, as if time itself was warping, bending around him. The leader of the organization took a step back, his eyes wide with shock and confusion, realizing what Lucas had decided. "What are you doing?" the man asked, his calm demeanor vanishing. Lucas stared at him, his expression now firm and resolute, undoing what Vernier should have done a long time ago. In one swift motion, Lucas pressed the watch's internal mechanism, activating its self-destruction function. The building around them began to tremble, and the sound of something cracking echoed throughout the space. The leader of the organization shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the growing sound of destruction. Lucas felt the time around him fragmenting, as if reality itself was coming apart. The watch began to crumble in his hands, and with it, the facility. Everything around Lucas seemed to be dissolving into a vortex of energy. He knew he wasn't just destroying the watch, but also any chance the organization had of wielding its power. The price would be high, but Lucas was ready. With one last glance at the leader, who was now disintegrating along with the collapsing reality, Lucas let the watch fall to the ground. Everything around him began to disappear. The world around Lucas seemed to unravel in layers of light and shadow. The facility, once solid and imposing, now crumbled as if time itself was collapsing on top of it. He could feel the vortex growing around him, the energy from the watch ripping through reality, erasing the connections the organization had forged. The sound was deafening, as if the universe was protesting against what was about to happen. Lucas stood at the center of it all, and at the same time, he was just another piece in the vast scheme of time. He had made the choice Vernier had hesitated to make, and now the self-destruction of the watch meant the destruction of the power the organization had sought so desperately. Vernier's sacrifice was complete, and Lucas knew his own was now unfolding. His body shook as the structure around him began to collapse. Walls fell like cards, and the floor beneath his feet gave way little by little. Lucas still held the watch in his hands, watching as its final gears turned to dust. The glow emanating from the chip now faded slowly, like a star that had burned through all its fuel. The artifact was dying, taking with it the power to manipulate time. He knew what was coming next. Destroying the watch would not come without consequence. Time, which had been twisted and manipulated for generations, was now correcting itself violently. And Lucas, the unwilling guardian of the artifact, could not escape his responsibility. He felt the space around him fold, as though he was being pulled into a place beyond human comprehension. The light surrounding him grew more intense, the deafening noise reached its peak, and then, suddenly, everything went silent. The void that followed was deep and absolute. Lucas floated in a space without form, without sound. He didn't know if he was still alive, or if he had become part of the flow of time itself. The sensation of being suspended in nothingness lasted what could have been seconds or millennia. Time, for him, had lost all meaning. But slowly, a figure began to materialize in front of him. Lucas saw the outline of a person form in the void, someone he recognized. His mother, with a calm and serene expression, stood before him. She said nothing, but the look they shared spoke more than words ever could. Lucas felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The sacrifice had been made, and somehow, he sensed that his mother was there to guide him through whatever came next. The moment, however, was brief. His mother disappeared as quickly as she had appeared, and Lucas was pulled back into reality. When his feet touched the ground again, he was back in the physical world. The facility was gone. The watch, destroyed, had left nothing but ashes in his hands. The sky was overcast, but the storm that seemed inevitable never materialized. Lucas looked around, feeling the cold, fresh air fill his lungs. He was back, but nothing would ever be the same. The watch, the organization, all the power they coveted was gone. He knew the price he had paid was high, but the future was now free from manipulation. The sacrifice had been necessary, and with it, the cycle of control over time was broken. But something still troubled him. Even though the watch was destroyed, Lucas knew the consequences of his actions would continue. Time had been corrected, but that didn't mean everything would go back to normal. He felt a strange connection to the flow of time, as if part of him was now trapped somewhere, wandering between what was and what could have been. He could still feel the echo of the watch, like a distant shadow. As he walked back to the car, Lucas reflected on what he had lost and what he had saved. He had sacrificed more than he could have ever imagined, but he knew the world would never know about the battle he had fought. The organization, with all its secrets, had been defeated. The absolute power they had desired was out of reach, and now Lucas was the only one who knew the truth. When he got into the car, he felt a strange sense of relief, like he could finally breathe after so long. The weight of the watch was no longer in his pocket, and the responsibility he had carried was destroyed along with it. He looked up at the sky, now clear, and for a brief moment, he felt peace. But the sacrifice left scars. Lucas knew that, while he had survived, he would never be the same. He had touched something no one should touch, and now he carried the marks of it. There was no more watch, but time had marked him in other ways. He was different, changed inside. However, the world was safe. The absolute power the organization had craved was dispersed, and the timeline was out of reach for any further manipulation. Lucas could finally leave it all behind. The watch, the organization, the sacrifice, it was all over. The quiet of the road was comforting. Lucas started the car and drove away from the forest, away from the past, away from everything that had haunted him. He knew he was free now, but he also knew that time always leaves its mark. He had done what needed to be done, and now all that was left was to move forward. The watch was destroyed, and with it, any chance the organization had to control destiny. The sacrifice had been made, and the cycle of manipulation had finally come to an end. Lucas took a deep breath and kept driving, feeling the future open up in front of him. Time, at last, was free. The world around Lucas seemed to disintegrate into layers of light and shadow. The facility, once solid and imposing, was now crumbling, as if time itself was collapsing on top of it. He could feel the vortex growing, the energy from the watch tearing through reality, severing the links the organization had carefully forged. The sound was deafening, as though the universe itself was protesting against what was happening. Lucas stood at the center of it all, and yet, he was just another piece in the vast tapestry of time. He had made the choice that Vernier had feared to make, and now, with the destruction of the watch, the power the organization had sought for so long was unraveling. Vernier's sacrifice had been made, and Lucas knew that his own sacrifice was already in motion. His body trembled as the structure around him began to collapse. Walls crumbled like paper, and the ground beneath him was slowly giving way. Lucas still held the watch in his hands, watching as its final gears turned to dust. The glow that had once emanated from the chip was fading, like a star burning out. The artifact was dying, and with it, the power to manipulate time was disappearing. He knew what was coming. Destroying the watch wouldn't come without a price. Time, which had been twisted and manipulated for so long, was now violently correcting itself. And Lucas, the unwilling guardian of the artifact, couldn't escape the consequences. He felt the space around him fold in on itself, as though he was being pulled into a place beyond human comprehension. The light around him grew brighter, the deafening noise reached its peak, and then, suddenly, everything was silent. The void that followed was deep and absolute. Lucas found himself floating in a space without form, without sound. He wasn't sure if he was still alive, or if he had become part of the flow of time itself. The sensation of being suspended in nothingness stretched on for what felt like both seconds and millennia. Time, for Lucas, had lost all meaning. But slowly, a shape began to materialize in front of him. Lucas saw the outline of a person forming in the void, someone familiar. His mother, with a calm and peaceful expression, stood before him. She didn't speak, but the look they shared conveyed more than words could. Lucas felt a deep sense of peace, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The sacrifice had been made, and somehow, he knew his mother was there to guide him through whatever came next. The moment was brief. His mother disappeared as quickly as she had appeared, and Lucas was pulled back into reality. When his feet touched the ground again, he was back in the physical world. The facility was gone. The watch, now destroyed, had left only ashes in his hands. The sky above was overcast, but the storm that had threatened to break never came. Lucas looked around, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. He was back, but nothing would ever be the same. The watch, the organization, all the power they had coveted, was gone. He knew the price he had paid was steep, but the future was now free from manipulation. The sacrifice had been necessary, and with it, the cycle of control over time had been broken. But something still gnawed at him. Though the watch was destroyed, Lucas knew the ripple effects of his actions would continue. Time had been corrected, but that didn't mean everything would go back to normal. He felt a strange connection to the flow of time, as if part of him was now caught somewhere, drifting between what was and what could have been. He could still feel the echo of the watch, like a distant shadow. As he walked back to his car, Lucas reflected on what he had lost and what he had saved. He had sacrificed more than he ever could have imagined, but he knew that the world would never know about the battle he had fought. The organization, with all its secrets, had been defeated. The absolute power they had longed for was now out of their reach, and Lucas was the only one who knew the truth. When he got into the car, he felt a strange sense of relief, like he could finally breathe for the first time in a long while. The weight of the watch was no longer in his pocket, and the responsibility he had carried was gone along with it. He looked up at the sky, now clearing, and for a moment, he felt peace. But the sacrifice had left its scars. Lucas knew that, although he had survived, he would never be the same. He had touched something that no one should ever touch, and now he bore the marks of it. The watch was gone, but time had marked him in other ways. He was different, changed on the inside. However, the world was safe. The absolute power the organization had craved was scattered, and the timeline was no longer something they could manipulate. Lucas could finally put it all behind him. The watch, the organization, the sacrifice, it was all over. The quiet of the road was comforting. Lucas started the car and drove away from the forest, away from the past, away from everything that had haunted him. He knew he was free now, but he also knew that time always leaves its mark. He had done what needed to be done, and now all that was left was to move forward. The watch was destroyed, and with it, any chance the organization had of controlling fate. The sacrifice had been made, and the cycle of manipulation had finally come to an end. Lucas took a deep breath and continued driving, feeling the future open up before him. Time, at last, was free.